Okay, now let's talk about naming conventions. Basically, your website consists of individual files, which are your pages and images and folders, that are all linked together. Naming these files properly is a vitally important aspect of good web design, and there are some basic rules that you need to follow. Now, some of these rules are a little less crucial than they used to be, and a lot of today's browsers and servers will let you fudge a little, but I still think it's a good idea to do things the right way. It makes things so much easier later on if you need to go back and do things like fix broken links or rename files. First of all, don't use spaces in your file names. Meaning, when you go to save your web page, don't use the space bar if you have multiple words in the file's name. Like in this case here, we have aboutmycompany.html. Now, you still see names like this all over the web, and most browsers will actually still be able to bring up pages named this way, but look what happens to the address of the page. Every time a space appears, you see this little percentage sign followed by a 20, which is the way of denoting spaces in web addresses. In addition to being pretty ugly, imagine trying to tell somebody that the address of your web page is tcloud.com/about%20my%20company.html. If you really need to separate words in a file's name, try using either a hyphen or an underscore character. Like we see here, these are underscores. And you can see here it looks much cleaner in the address bar of the browser. Also consider using as short a file name as possible. The length of the file name doesn't really matter too much when you're linking to the page, but if you have to tell someone the address, you don't want to give him too much to type, or you'll increase the chance that he'll make a typo and not be able to find your page. So for example, instead of calling this page aboutmycompany.html, there's probably very little reason I can't just call it about.html. Some people like to use capital letters in their file names like this, about the company, and they'll use that as a solution to the no spaces thing, but another rule you should try to follow is to avoid using capital letters. Again, capital letters are okay in most situations, but some Unix servers are case sensitive, and you'll have to remember exactly how you capitalize things each time you want to bring up a page. So it's much easier just to leave everything lowercase and use underscores to denote spaces. And you should also avoid using certain characters in your file names. Underscores and hyphens are okay, but avoid using dots, quotes, forward and backslashes, colons, exclamation points, question marks, and parentheses in your file names. Things like dots are reserved for placing before the file's extension, and slashes are used to indicate that a file is a nested directory. Basically, you should avoid using anything other than letters or numbers in your file names. And lastly, let's talk about these file name extensions. Basic web page file names end in either .html or .htm. Both are acceptable. .htm was initially used in the early days of the web because early DOS servers didn't allow for extensions that were longer than 3 characters. But that's not really an issue at all these days, so .html is fine. But you really should just pick one and stick with it. Don't have some pages that end with .htm and others that end with .html within the same site. It might cause confusion, especially if you have identically named files in a folder like index.html and index.htm. You can set your default preferences under Dreamweaver's preferences by going to the new document category in your preferences, and here you can choose whether you want your files to end with .html or .htm.